So Dalton Ross wrote an article. It's the oral history. It says it's Dan's funeral, an oral history of the greatest Big Brother moment ever, says Dalton Ross. I feel like I have to agree. Dan's funeral from season 14 of Big Brother, in my opinion, is the greatest Big Brother moment in history. And really, in my eyes, from my perspective, the best reality show moment in reality TV history. One of the best moves ever made by one of the best players to ever play. It's great stuff. Blue Girl, thank you for the bits there. Which is about great BB moments. Did we switch from casual Taran to business Taran? I don't know. So Dalton Ross, he's a journalist for EW. Writes about Big Brother and Survivor and plenty of other shows, I'm sure. And so he got in contact with Dan Giesling, and everybody else that was involved in the moment here, the funeral, including Danielle Murphy, Jen Arroyo, Shane Meany, Ian Terry, Brittany Haynes, Frank, and Joe Arvin. As well as some of the executive producers of the show, like, let's see here, who did he get? They're a bit of the way down here. Rich Meehan, Allison Grodner. He got Julie. Did he get anyone else? Frank. Heath, did they get Heath, or did they just talk about Heath? Am I not in sync? Is this any better? I think they just talked about Heath, yeah. So, got a bunch of people to come and talk about this move, which was a Herculean effort, really. Because you can tell from the topics here that, by the comments here, that there's some people that are still mad about it to this day. To this day. I honestly have no idea how he managed to get Frank to talk about it. Very upset, Frank is. So we're here, and we're going to talk through the article and what my perspective was watching it as a live feeder. I do feel like there were some blanks that can be filled in here as we talk through it. But I want to like sort of explain why I think this is one of the greatest moments ever, one of the greatest moves ever. There were a lot of things that went into it, and there's a lot to talk about. So let's talk through it. Let's do it. So I'm gonna run through my memory. Now I'm going mostly off of memory here. Big Brother 14 is a season that I probably know better than most. So my memory should be decent, but obviously it's not going to be perfect. The players themselves couldn't remember a lot of what was happening. So I apologize if there are things that I'm leaving out or forgetting, but there are some stuff. There's some stuff here to talk about. So let's set the stage, right? Let's set the stage for the funeral. If you're really not in the know here, season 14 of Big Brother, it starts with Dan Dan Giesling, Brittany Haynes, Janelle, and Mike Boogie are 4 coaches, previous players from the past seasons that are going to come and join in the new season of Big Brother. And they choose teams. They choose 3 players each, and they each have a team of players, and the initial conceit is that if one of their players wins, then they get a small amount of money as the prize that their player won. But that was all a ruse to just kind of get these people involved and in the house and eventually playing the game. So yes, we have the article is linked there in the chat. I recommend you check it out. You can Google Dalton Ross, Dan's funeral. I'm sure it'll come up if you're watching along. Thank you, Jolly Worms, for that subscription. So the article starts off here. It sets up what Big Brother is. It sets up the alliance that was formed. It's called the Quack Pack. So Dan and the coaches, they enter the game, and this is important because the way that they entered the game was pretty dramatic. Frank, one of the people involved here, is going to... Frank was on his way out the door. He was about to be voted out of the game when all of a sudden, twist everyone, watch out, it's a reset. Something that Big Brother 21 fans might be wary of right now, just in case. But there was a reset, and the reset was that the coaches were entering the game, and therefore, for some reason, the eviction was canceled. Now, this was a very, very important moment in Big Brother 14, because Dan had been pretending to work with Mike Boogie and Frank. Now, Mike Boogie and Frank were very, very tight in the game. They'd been working very closely together. And so when Dan was about to vote Frank out, the idea was that Frank would be gone, Boogie would have nowhere else to turn but Dan. Dan was genuinely working close with Boogie, and once Frank was gone, he'd be able to reel Boogie in as a closer ally. Yes, I lied to you, but we got to do this. It's Chilltown, right? Chilltown 2.0. Thank you, Kesaba, for that subscription. So that was the plan, but the plan was ruined when joining the game canceled the eviction, and Frank stayed in the game, and Dan couldn't hide the fact that he'd been lying to Frank and had been lying to Mike Boogie, and so he has to come clean because everybody knew that the vote was about to go down a certain way. There was no hiding it, and so Dan has to cop to the fact that I was going to evict Frank. I'm sorry. Frank is massively pissed, and the relationship will never recover between Dan and Frank. Frank knows now that Dan was trying to get him out so that he could work with Boogie, and he's not okay with that. Frank hates Dan with a passion. He talks constantly in the house about how Dan ruined his dream, because it was Frank's dream to be on Big Brother for so long, and now he has the chance, and Dan came in, somebody who already won the game, and he ruined the dream. It wasn't my fault that I was about to be evicted. It was Dan's fault. Dan flipped the vote against me. And now I'm still in the house, but I was almost about to go home, and it's all his fault. And now I can't play the way that I want to play. I'm forced to win competitions. I wanted to play like Dr. Will, like Dan himself. I want to be throwing competitions. I want to play an ultimate social and strategic game. But instead, I'm on the block every time I haven't won a competition, and it's all Dan's fault. He talked about it constantly. Thank you, David, there for the subscription. Constantly he talked about it. He hated Dan. He hated him. And for a long time, he wanted Dan out. And there was a lot of pressure. Dan was able to build enough around him that he was protected. He eventually formed this alliance called the Quack Pack. It had, as the article points out, Dan, Brittany, Danielle, Shane, and Ian. were all part of the Quack Pack, which was an offshoot of the Silent Six, which Dan had formed with Mike Boogie and Frank. And so the idea was that Frank really wanted to go after Dan, but people like Mike Boogie and Brittany were preventing Frank from going after Dan. They kept telling him, no, don't go after Dan. It's too soon. It's too early. We can trust Dan. And Frank was constantly like, no, we can't. He was about to vote me out. What are you talking about? I don't like this guy. He's got to go. But they wouldn't let him, even when he was HOH. He really wanted to put Dan on the block, but they wouldn't let him. And so he didn't. And then what do you know? The following week, Dan and company betray Mike Boogie and Frank. And the reason they betrayed Mike Boogie and Frank is because Ian, who is another member of the, another person here in the article, Ian was on Mike Boogie's coaching team. Mike Boogie's coaching team consisted of Ian and Frank and Jen, who is also going to be a member in this story here. And so Ian was secretly working with the Quack Pack, which was, as I mentioned, an offshoot of the Silent Six. Basically, the Silent Six was formed in the HOH with Dan, Brittany, Shane and Danielle in a showmance, quote unquote, Brittany and Dan, two vets, and then Mike Boogie and Frank. And the idea was to all work together, the Silent Six. And then Mike Boogie and Frank left, and they brought up Ian, and they said, okay, Ian, we're in a 5-person alliance called the Quack Pack. It was a joke at first. It was a ploy at first, as many alliances start out as, really. But Ian kept running information back to the Quack Pack about Frank and Boogie. Now, you have to understand, Frank and Boogie, they love talking trash. Every morning they'd be out there talking trash about all these people, including Dan, especially from Frank. Frank was constantly talking trash about Dan because he didn't trust him. And so that, of course, is going to get back to Ian, who relays it back to the rest of the Quack Pack. And the Quack Pack starts to feel like they can't trust Frank and Mike Boogie. They can't. This Silent Six thing, it's not going to work. Frank is too dangerous. He's too good at competitions. And again, he was HOH and really was constantly pushing, I want to backdoor Dan. I want to put him on the block. I want him to go home. And Brittany had to constantly be in his ear, being like, no, this is a bad move. Don't do that. Thank you, Crossmouse. Don't do that. It's not a good move. Please, you can trust Dan. But it wasn't working. And so they decide they need to betray Frank and Mike Boogie. They need to get Frank out of this game. He is too hot-headed. He is just too forcefully not working with us here. And so they take a shot at Frank. And they miss. Because Frank, as I mentioned, he was either on the block or he was winning competitions. And he won a lot of competitions. He won the veto. He said, I wish I had 2 of these jokers, Mike Boogie, because by taking himself down, Mike Boogie ends up being evicted that week. And this is all lead up to the article here. Before Mike Boogie is evicted, now Mike Boogie's eviction heads into a double eviction. And before the eviction, I remember, Mike and Frank, they were talking. Mike knew he was leaving, and he would talk to Frank about Dan, because they felt like when they got betrayed, they felt like Dan was the cause, that Frank had been right all along. They could never trust Dan. He had betrayed them before, and so now it's all Dan's fault. Dan has flipped the Silent Six against them, because he's jealous or schemy or just a terrible person or whatever. They liked to talk about Dan's wife. They liked to talk about all sorts of things that they would do. I remember Boogie very, very intently made sure Frank promised him, you promised me, Frank, you will not let Dan win this game. You promise me you will evict Dan and you will humiliate him on his way out the door. That you will taunt him on his way out the door. Please, Frank, you have to promise me this. And Frank said, of course. I'm going to stick his head on a pike. I'm going to kill this guy. They were dead set. They really were pissed at Dan. Little did they know, Ian was really the person that had betrayed them. Now, granted, Dan was absolutely a part of the betrayal as well, but they didn't realize that Ian had a part in it as well. So it all fell on Dan. They berated Dan, and he took it all. He didn't rat Ian out. He didn't try to pass the blame. He took the blame. Because, I mean, what are the odds that Frank wins in HOH? Surely they'll be able to get Frank out. Surely. It's just one person. And once he's gone, the rest of the ride is smooth sailing. But it's not the case. So they head into the double eviction. Ian wins the HOH. Ian, who is still pretending to work with Frank, and he puts Frank and Ashley on the block. Frank and Ashley was Frank's next closest ally after Boogie. Frank wins Veto again. He's safe again. And of course, this is a double eviction, so the audience can be heard during the veto. And Frank was kind of a fan favorite at the time, and continues to be. And so the audience is cheering Frank on when he wins that veto, and that really sets in. He's going to be talking about that for a while afterward. Oh, the audience loves me. I'm clearly being portrayed well. That definitely means that they see what a scumbag that Dan is. That they're definitely supporting me here. And so that's how Frank felt about that, because he could hear those cheers. And so he wins that veto, and Ashley ends up going home that week. And Ian actually essentially tries to do what Steve did when he won the double eviction and sent out Jackie, and Steve was like, I'm so sorry, it was totally Vanessa that convinced me to do that. Ian does a little bit of that, not intentionally really, but like he goes to Frank, he's like, I'm sorry, I got confused, I didn't know what to do, I'm still working with you, Frank. And Frank was like, oh, you working with me or you working with Dan? He's like, I'm working with you, Frank. I'm not working with Dan, I promise. And Frank was pissed. Frank felt that Dan had manipulated Ian into doing that, and that it was disgraceful of Dan to do that. That he was preying upon this insecure child and forcing him to do his dirty work. He had no respect for that style of gameplay. People talk about the funeral as the reason why Frank didn't vote for Dan in the end. They forget how much Frank already hated Dan. A lot. Like, Frank had already made a vow to not vote for Dan in the final two. He had already promised Boogie to not let him win. He already didn't respect Dan's style of gameplay. He hated the fact that he said to people, why do people always talk about how Dan's a nice guy? He's not a nice guy. He's not. He's gross. And I promise you, I'm not making this up. You can, if there are clips out there, I'm sure there are recaps out there that can back this stuff up. And you know, maybe the details aren't 100%, but I'm pretty solid on these. Again, I have a pretty good memory of season 14. So Frank wins that veto. He stays in the game. They head into the next HOH, and the plan is to target Frank. Basically everybody's targeting Frank, really. All they have to do is beat him in this HOH competitions. Surely they'll be able to get Frank out of the game. But no, not the case. For the third straight week, he's going to win a competition to keep himself safe. He's going to win the HOH, and me, as somebody watching the live feeds at the time, a big fan of Dan playing the game, I was very, very upset. Come on! Seriously? I was annoyed from the very start. From the second they kept Frank in the game when he was supposed to leave, I was like, give me a break. And I was very annoyed with how gross he would talk in general. Again, the thing you have to remember about Dan never took anything to a personal level. The worst he ever gets is in this sequence of events when he gets pissed off at Ian and Danielle. But he never goes personal, not nearly in the way that Frank and Boogie did at various points throughout the season. And so I really appreciated that about Dan, and I really didn't love the way that that Frank would talk about him in general. So Frank wins this HOH. I'm devastated. Ugh. Dan's dead. There's nothing he can do. It's done. He's got to win the veto. What can we do? What can we do? So that's where we kick off here with the article. A bit here. Frank is going to end up nominating Dan and Danielle. Prior to that, I remember, and this is one of the reasons why I loved watching Dan on the feeds. I remember Dan immediately starting to work, okay, absolute worst case scenario for the third week in a row. How do I get out of this one? And I remember I think Dan's plan was at the time, Joe was not a close ally of Frank's, and there was reason to believe that Joe might be targeted by Frank. And so the idea was that Dan was coming up with was, okay, I need to talk to Joe, make sure I have his vote. But what he wanted to do was it was to coordinate his story with Joe, to get Joe against Ian, so that Joe would throw Ian under the bus, and then Dan might throw Ian under the bus, and then if they both do that, then maybe Frank will target Ian, and if he doesn't, maybe he'll put Joe on the block next to Dan, because he thinks they're working together because they had the same story, and then they'd have the numbers to send Joe home. Or if he gets him to target Ian, then it's Ian. Right from the get-go, when Frank won the HOH, Dan was thinking about, okay, should I throw Ian under the bus? I've stored this ace card in my back pocket for weeks. Something that most players would never even think to do. A lot of people, all he did was throw Ian under the bus. Anybody could have done that. But most people would have, when they were confronted weeks ago, been like, no, it's not me, it's Ian. Ian was the one. They would have immediately used that card with no advantage. I've never seen anybody hold on to a card like that for this long, even after Dan's funeral, and they saw how effective it was. But Dan held it, and he held it, and once Frank won, he was like, okay, should I use it? Should I throw Ian under the bus? And he wasn't sure, because he felt like it would piss off his alliance, and if he pisses off his alliance, then if he does manage to end up on the block next to Joe, then he wouldn't have the numbers to stay next to Joe necessarily. So he had to be very careful about when he told Frank about Ian, because if he did it prior to the nominations, it could not work. There's a lot of ways, there's a lot of time for it to be reversed. And so he toyed with the idea, decided against it for now. He wanted to feel out where Frank stood, and he wanted to try and stick to Joe like glue. Make it seem like Joe is his number one ally if possible, or at the very least that they are in coordination, and that hopefully he wouldn't have to go up on the block next to Danielle, because that would suck. He would definitely go home there. So that was the idea. And at the time, Joe also felt like he had an alliance. It was the Headhunters Alliance. So Dan would be like, hey, we got to keep the Headhunters safe, Joe. We need to pitch that Ian needs to go up on the block. And Joe would be like, yeah. But it never went anywhere, because Frank right away immediately knew it's Dan and Danielle, period. End of story. Dan and Danielle going on the block. If Dan wins the veto, Danielle goes home. He's losing his closest ally, or he's going home. It has to be one of those two. It has to be. So that's what he tells Brittany this. He tells Ian. He eventually tells Danielle. Now, Brittany was in on the plan to try to get Joe nominated. There was a lot of talk throughout the article of like the Quack Pack and how loyal they were to Dan, and how like, oh, Dan, how could he try to win the veto? We were so betrayed. But they were not, from my memory, they were not loyal to Dan at all. Brittany immediately abandoned the plan to try to get Joe on the block next to Dan when she talked to Frank. Now, at this point in time, thank you, Wonder Woman. At this point in time, Ian was still pretending to work with Frank, and was very scared of ever betraying him. He was worried about what would happen. He was very worried about how Boogie would feel about him after the show, and he was very worried about Frank coming for him if he ever was revealed to be a traitor, a rat. And so Brittany and Shane had been working on Frank for a while. Now, Brittany and Shane were very tight. They had originally been part of the same coaching team. Shane was one of Brittany's players. And so they were working very closely. And the idea was that her, Shane, and Ian were kind of like, oh, we're on your side, Frank. We're on your side. Yeah, that Dan, not trustworthy. And so she was trying to work that angle, trying to keep Frank safe, trying to keep Frank thinking he's safe, while secretly working against him. She was playing both sides of the house. She was playing the Quack Pack. She was playing Frank. She had Shane. The Shane Frank dynamic, as Doom Tribe points out there, was interesting. They constantly talked about how they were the only deserving winners of the show. Because they were like these two, buff alpha dudes that and winning competitions, that they were the only deserving winners. Lone Ranger, thank you. And that they needed each other in the game because of their prowess. And so Frank and Shane kind of bonded over that. Brittany was constantly working Frank. Ian was still pretending to be on Frank's side. And so they were trying to play that angle. And the idea was for them to play that angle to get Joe on the block. But as I said, Frank immediately was like, nah, it's Dan and Danielle. And Brittany was like, okay. In fact, Brittany quickly is going to start talking about like, well, I mean, you should do Dan and Danielle. Dan, he's shady. Can't trust Dan. I don't trust Dan. She immediately, and this, I remember this, like she immediately turned on Dan. It was like, okay, well, if it's Dan and Danielle, then bye, Dan. Gotta go. She says Danielle will never turn on Dan. She will vote to keep him. She will use the veto on him. Danielle has to go up on the block next to Dan if you want to send Dan home. And I will vote Dan out. I will. This Frank, Frank, everyone Frank talked to that week, he's like, Dan, he's a coward. He doesn't respect him. You ruined my dream. Brittany is like, once Dan is gone, we can work together. And that was a lie. She was going to try to evict him afterward. But she's like, absolutely, we'll totally work together. We'll send Dan home and then we'll absolutely work together. So Frank also talks to Ian. Ian also betrays Dan. Even before now Brittany, theoretically, when Frank told Brittany that oh, sorry, it's going to be Dan and Danielle. Brittany kind of was like, okay, it's Dan and Danielle. Definitely should put up Danielle. We'll send out Dan. Ian immediately was like, oh, no, don't put up Joe. Put up Danielle. You got to put up Danielle. You have to nominate Danielle if you want Dan out. Didn't even try. Frank also told Danielle about it. She was super upset. I remember Danielle was under the impression for a long time that oh my God, It's me and Dan on the block together. I mean, if he wins the veto, he'll use it on me because he's just such a good guy. And Frank, I don't think so. No, he will. Just you watch. Really, she really felt that was, she really felt that he would do that. But not. No, of course not. Frank lets more people know, what's happening here. Danielle eventually tells Dan they're going on the block. I remember he was again like, oh crap, like should we out Ian then? Should we throw him under the bus? Like, is now the time? If it's us going on the block, then we're screwed. Maybe now is the time to throw Ian under the bus, to rat him out. And here's the thing too. Danielle had already talked to Frank and told him, like, Ian is a lot more culpable than you think. And Frank was like, okay, are you sure? Okay. But he was still like, no, it's all Dan. Dan manipulated him. I remember Jen had talked to Frank saying, no, Ian is a lot more culpable than you think. And Frank was like, okay. I mean, he's obviously shady, this Ian, but it's still Dan's fault. It's always Dan's fault. So it's not like Frank didn't already know some of this anyway. It was the way that Dan eventually needed to present it to him that ultimately finally made the impact. So Dan knows he's going on the block now. He knows the Joe plan isn't going to work. So now he's on to, okay, well, my last card to play is throwing Ian under the bus. But there was a lockdown, and they were thinking that there was going to be a Pandora's box. They were anticipating that there was going to be a Pandora's box. And so Dan wanted to wait until after that to throw Ian under the bus, just to see where that takes them. We'll see what happens with this Pandora's box thing. Ultimately, the Pandora's box thing turns out to be a second veto for the week, and Ian is going to win this one, and that's about where we join the article. And I remember Brittany was pissed at Dan during the competition because she felt like he should have given them his quarters because he was really bad at the machine. Basically, like, there were a bunch of things that came down. You had to find quarters, and then you'd go into the what is now the boat room, and then put the quarters in, and then try to get like the veto thing. And Dan was really bad at it and kept trying, and so they felt like Dan should have been giving them his quarters, because if they won the extra veto, then they could use that in combination with the veto to then save everyone. So they were mad at Dan about that, and Dan was really mad at Ian because Ian was really trying hard to win to prevent Dan from winning. Feel free to ask questions along the way here. And so it's a lot of people saying like, oh, this is the save Dan veto. So they introduced this to save Dan. Very much I disagree with that concept. First of all, again, like these are all planned ahead of time. And I know this. Second, later in the week, Ian really felt a lot of pressure from production and the diary room to not use this veto, to not save Dan with it. So if you are somebody that believes in conspiracy theories, then that is much stronger evidence, in my opinion, of where they were at the time. But Dan got really pissed at Ian because Ian was really trying hard to win and like taking quarters, and I believe that there was he was like letting Dan go first to waste his quarters, stuff like that. And so at one point Dan was like super pissed at Ian. He was like, I will rat you out in a heartbeat. Just you wait. And that ended up getting back to Frank, and Frank was like, that's a weird thing to say in a competition. I'll rat you out. Why would he say that? You think there's information there? And again, like people like Dan went psycho. Dan lost his mind. Again, this is my perspective, and I'm obviously coming from a place of liking Dan, of knowing Dan, but from my perspective of like what the record shows and what Dan has actually done in the house, like, yeah, he definitely lost his temper. He definitely yelled that he would rat Ian out. But again, he never like made fun of Ian. He never said anything rude or mean to Ian. It was always game. It was always like I'll rat you out like in the game. And he even says in this article later, like he wanted to say to Danielle, "You're dead to me," but he went with, "In this game, you're dead to me." Like, absolutely, Dan was mad and he yelled at Ian, and sure, not denying that, not saying that that's not, he got mad. But you take that in comparison to like literally anybody else that ever plays the game, and most people have done much worse. You know what I mean? So that's my own perspective on that. I would prefer that he didn't yell at anybody, but most people have yelled at most people in the house. I mean, even just like look at this season, look at last season, look at any of these seasons. Like, most of these people have done at least that, if not worse. Except for maybe Nicole this season. She's been pretty good. So he yelled at Ian that he was going to rat him out. Ian has the second veto here. Thank you, Daquan. So we kind of cut into the article here. Ian now has this veto, and now we can cut to it. Frank is saying, "It was a rough night for me." After winning HOH, he was upset because he felt like he wasn't going to win the game, and that all his allies were gone, and that he was going to have to win all the competitions moving forward. That's not really my memory of how Frank was acting in the house. Granted, these absolutely could have been his thoughts, but I remember Frank kind of feeling like he was in an okay spot. Maybe not immediately after he won. Maybe that came later. But from my memory, Frank was in a position where he felt like he had Ian, Brittany, and Shane. He actually trusted them a decent amount, and he felt like he also had Jen and Joe, and that he could reel them in on the other side. And so he was kind of in this, what is right now the sort of Jackson Hawley position, where because he was in power, he ended up feeling like he could play that because now people were coming to him and saying that they would work with him. He was like, "Oh, people will work with me. Great. All right." So Dan says that he got nominated, but they still had some outs. Danielle says she was devastated. That tracks. How can she campaign against Dan? She didn't feel like she needed to, because she thought Dan would use the veto on her. She felt like she would stay. She knew he was the target. Ian says that he wasn't happy, and he had the veto. And he was worried about protecting Brittany at the time, which is definitely fair. Frank says again, Dan was a personal nomination for him. He said there was strategy to it as well, which was also true. That Frank had talked about how he felt like if he removed Dan, then he could work with Ian, because Dan was the reason Ian was doing bad things. And so and he also said, of course, he'd wanted to take shots at Dan for a long time, and so Dan was definitely the target. And so once Ian gets the veto, Dan is immediately like, "Thank God I didn't rat him out before this." Oh, that's a close one. All right, good thing I waited, because now, and this was Dan's idea, if Brittany or Shane wins the veto, then they can use it on me or Danielle. Ian can use his second veto on me or Danielle, and then 4 of the 5 of us can be safe. Only one of us will end up staying on the block. We'll have the votes to keep that one safe, and boom, we're good. So that was the plan. But the crux of it at that point was, thank God I didn't throw Ian under the bus, because I'll need his help and I'll need the votes from my alliance. But also, he wanted to make sure that Ian didn't get put up on the block, because Ian was not immune from nominations. Frank could still nominate Ian and just force him to burn the veto. So the next goal was to make sure that Frank didn't nominate Ian, because then Ian wouldn't be able to use the veto and they wouldn't be able to do that. And so obviously, from Frank's perspective, this could have been disastrous if this plan worked out. Not that anything wasn't disastrous anyway. So, and I found this interesting because Dan didn't even remember this part of the plan when he was talking about it with Dalton. So that was the next part. He needs to convince Frank to not put Ian on the block. Now, Dan, when he initially was nominated, he was thinking through, like, how do I play this? He had the Joe thing, but overall his plan was to act defeated and go to Frank and really fan Frank's ego. Oh, Frank, you're such a better man than me. Oh boy, you've done such a great job. You beat me. We took our shots and we missed. You're so good. I hope you know that even if I stay somehow, I'm not coming for you in this game. So he does some of that. At this point, he's trying to get himself and Danielle on the block instead of Ian. And so that's kind of the point here. Brittany is also going to be in on this plan. She's trying to convince Frank that Ian will not use the veto. And so she's really, again, playing up the fact that she is working with Frank and will work with Frank moving forward. And so why would Frank make Ian burn the veto when they're all working together? So Frank does put up Dan and Danielle. They're on the block. And so this is the plan. That they need Ian to use the veto. They just need to get Brittany or Shane to win it, and then they can, boom, they're good. But there was a lot of hesitation from the Quack Pack to actually follow through with this plan, because it meant blowing up their own spots. Shane, Brittany, and Ian all had good relationships with Frank, and they were playing both sides, and they didn't want to out themselves. And by winning this veto and making this huge play, they were basically outing themselves in the game as anti-Frank. So Ian says how this would work is that all the people would get the veto, and then it didn't matter who was left on the block; they would have the votes. And Brittany says the same. Shane confirms. In order for the plan to work, Brittany and Shane had to be picked for the veto. They both were picked in the veto. They felt good about that. And so here's we decided to carry out the plan. It's going to be great. There was a lot of back and forth, actually, that I remember, that Ian was really hesitating about using this power. Part of the reason why Brittany was mad at Dan for trying to win the initial veto was because he was trying to. Ian ended up winning it, and they didn't know if they could trust Ian to use this veto. Thank you, Secret Lucas. Thank you so much. They didn't know if they could trust Ian to use the veto. And Dan was like telling Brittany, like, hey, you need to be the one to talk Ian into doing this, because as Dan later talks about, like, using other people to convince other people is usually the best way to go about it. And so Brittany did talk to Ian and kind of got him to agree to use the veto, but he later was like, actually, maybe not. I don't know. I can't. I don't want to betray Frank. I don't want to do that. I don't want to. I'm going to make him mad. I don't want to make him mad. This is around the time he said that he was in the diary room and he felt like they were pushing really hard for him to not use the veto, to not go through with this plan. Because again, like, people are like, oh man, production really trying to save Dan with all these extra vetoes. Frank was the production favorite. Frank was the fan favorite. They really wanted Frank to win. If there was any manipulation, it was definitely in favor of Frank. And I don't believe in that sort of manipulation, but it was definitely in favor of Frank. And Ian, this is one of the few times like that it's really just blatantly called out. Ian was like, no, like they were like, how does that benefit you, Ian, to use the veto? Like, he really felt like they were pushing him to not use it. And so he was like, he was kind of backing out of it. He was like, I don't know if I want to do this. I don't want to betray Frank. And so he was kind of wishy-washy on this, and Dan kind of picked up on it. Danielle said to him that, you know, Ian was telling her to try in the veto, and why would she be trying in the veto if she's supposed to throw it? And so Dan was like, hold on here, I can't throw this veto if you guys aren't on board. Like, that's not okay. And there was even, I remember there was a conversation between Brittany and Ian where they talked about, like, Dan goes, I mean, it's not the worst thing in the world, right? Like, he goes, you know? This kind of works for us there, actually. So maybe we don't need to, I don't know, who knows? We'll see it. We'll see how it goes. But they definitely talked about the idea of, like, well, maybe we won't go through with this. But Brittany was really worried that she would go up on the block if Dan or Danielle won the veto. So she wanted to make sure that Ian said that he would use the veto. Thank you, Jen Law. Thank you. So Dan actually told Brittany. So here we get in this article, Danielle says she was going to throw it. Brittany says Dan was supposed to throw it. This conversation I remember happening. Ian says, Dan said to me, you have to promise me something. If I throw it, I'm still up there. You have to vote for me to stay. And at that point, I can say, yeah, sure. But he knows there's no way I could convince them at that that was going to be the case. There's no chance. I mean, there's a point in the game where you can lie, but it's just like trying to pee on somebody's leg and tell them it's raining. So there's no way I can ever expect him to believe that. That was the one where I thought there was no point in telling that lie. So he said, I can't. You just have to throw it. I can't promise that. I'm sorry. I remember that conversation because what happened was that after Danielle told Dan that Ian was telling her to win the competition, that Dan was like, okay, so we can't rely on Ian to use this veto. And so he told Brittany, Dan went to Brittany and said, I can't throw this competition. Ian's not going to use the veto. So I'm not going to throw this competition and then get screwed over by Ian, like, when he doesn't use it. Like, I need to try to win. And that freaked Brittany out because she was concerned that if Dan won the veto, that she would go on the block and she could go home. And so she ran to Ian and said, you need to tell Dan that you are going to use that veto because I'm going to go up on the block if he wins this. He needs to throw this competition. And so Ian went back to Dan and said, look, I'm definitely going to use the veto. And Dan was like, you're really going to use the veto? He was like, yeah, I promise you, I'm going to use the veto. It's definitely going to happen. And at that point, Dan was like, okay, so if I throw this, are you going to vote for me to stay? If I stay on the block? And Ian got pissed off. And he said, no, I'm not going to promise that. And then he went back to Brittany and was like, this guy... Now you give him something and he wants even more. He keeps taking. He wants me to promise to vote for him to stay? No, I'm not going to do that. And so obviously Dan did not feel comfortable throwing the veto at that point. So So at that point, they go into the veto competition. This is when Dan says, "I'm sure I told them I would throw it, but I can tell you for a fact that this one I tried to win." It's funny. Dan doesn't even remember this happening, I guess, but he did remember trying to win. So then we get to the veto competition in the article here. So the article says the veto competition was a draw something challenge hosted by Ian, in which, because Ian was not eligible to compete because he already had a veto, in which the players, including Jen, who was picked by Dan with the house guest choice chip, would have to buzz in and guess the object being drawn. If they were correct, they had to do a punishment, and if they wanted to collect the points that toward winning. Frank got the first question right with avocado. He had to dye himself green to receive the 2 points, but the Quack Pack was shocked when Dan, who was supposed to be throwing it for Brittany and Shane, buzzed in and got question number 2 correct with hunger. So Dan had told Brittany he was going to try to win, and then after Ian came to him, he was like, okay, maybe I'll throw it then. But like, this was definitely not like, oh, we're so shocked that Dan was trying to win this competition. Like, they had an idea. Dan had already said he wanted to win this one because he didn't know if he could trust Ian. But memory is a thing. And certainly I can see that Brittany would have been pissed because she was the one that was going to go on the block if Dan won. So once she saw that Dan was going to try to win, obviously she was going to be like, "Rah! Damn it, Dan!" And she says she didn't blame him, which I believe as well. I think that obviously she was just frustrated in that moment because the plan was not only to keep Dan safe, but to keep her safe, that she wouldn't end up on the block. And so she was really annoyed at that. And Dan talks about how he remembers seeing Brittany's face and being like, oh crap, I really just pissed them off, I guess. Dan talks about seeing Brittany. Brittany talks about being frustrated. That they all this stuff. But again, like these people definitely turned their back on him. So it was 7 years ago, but it was definitely the case there. Shane talks about how he sucked at this one. Shane didn't want to win anyway, actually. Shane, again, one of the key figures in this so-called plan, was talking about like how he didn't want to win because, again, he didn't want to be the one to betray Frank. After, oh no, only we deserve to win the game. And so he talked about like, can I just throw it to you, Brittany? Like, can you do it for me? So he says he was bad at this anyway. Brittany says he definitely could have just said, look, my life is on the line. I can't throw this competition. And everyone would have understood. But he did say that to her at one point. But, Ian says he was frustrated with it. But again, Ian was already frustrated with Dan and had already mentioned that he might not want to use the veto, so obviously Dan would want to win. After Jen got clock, Brittany got shackle. Frank got 3 in a row with shower, carrot, and bench. And then Danielle buzzed in with spots. And this pissed Dan off because at this point in the game, Danielle had no chance to win. And so her buzzing in with spots took away points that Dan could have gotten, and so she was basically just like at that point helping Frank win the veto. And so he was like, again, this is Dan at his worst. Super in like life or death mode, and he's like, what are you doing? This doesn't benefit either of us. Why are you buzzing in here? And so they talk about how Dan was super pissed about that. This is a funny Danielle moment in those quotes. Dan got the next question right with trip, and that's what gave him the 24-hour solitary confinement punishment. And Dan talked about how he was scared of that. Like, oh crap, I can't be confined. I need to be able to campaign. And so this is when Danielle says that she knew he had been lying, and that he was again, like Danielle says, when I see him buzz in again, I know that he lied. He is being selfish and doesn't really give an S about me. I'm really upset at this point because I'm now pissed off, but you're putting my relationship in danger. If Shane or Brittany had won, no problems, but to be honest, I did not want to win the veto because me sitting on the block means I don't have to cast a vote, which means I have more friends in the jury. Dan definitely told her that he wanted to win this veto, and after a long time of her thinking that Dan would use the veto on her, he also told her that he needs to win and use it on himself, and that then he would keep Danielle safe. She knew that he was trying to win this veto. So, not sure what's going on there. So at this point, it comes down to Frank and Dan. For the most part, it's down to Frank and Dan. Dan's the only person that can catch up to Frank at this point. And the final question is down to is either Dan gets it or Frank wins. And this is when the whole controversy stuff happens. Brittany talks about how she buzzed in, and she was like, what's the answer? And then Frank said, Summer. And Frank talks about how he was just like, and I think Jen mentions it too. Like, this is not the first time that Frank had done something like this. And so this is a cool moment in the article, actually. They talk to Rich Meehan, who says, I was watching the game go down from our office. Obviously, we're watching it in real time as it's happening. My phone rang in my office. It was Heath, who calls me and says, hey, this just happened. Frank whispered the answer to Brittany, a clear rule violation. I said, okay. I ran up to the Big Brother booth where we talk to the house guests from. They just hear our voice, but it's where we talk to them from, and we have a machine in there that we can roll back tape. So we roll back the tape, and we rewatched it multiple times, just that we're 1,000% sure. Didn't take much to see it, but it was very clear. Then I called Allison. Allison says, I had just gone home. I remember Rich calling me and running the decision and the situation and the decision by me. If there's going to be some really important and tough fairness calls to make, we do have to make sure that everyone that needs to be consulted is consulted, and that we ultimately agree that we're making the right decision. And in this one, there was no doubt about it. We heard it, we saw it, and we made the ruling. Rich says it was kind of a discipline, any kind of discipline thing. We call the network and say, hey, this just happened. Here's the call, and it's crystal clear. And then we just make the decision. So that's why there's a bit of a stop down, because we want to make sure that everything is 100% correct. So when something like that happens, we probably stop the game for about 15 minutes. Like they do have to check in with certain people. They do have to do that whole thing. Which I thought was an interesting look into the process there. So Frank ends up being disqualified, and so now with Frank gone, anybody can win this. Anybody that decides to buzz in, except for Shane, who is out of contention. Dan, Brittany, or Jen could all win this competition. And so it comes down to, once again, this final question. And this time, Jen gets the question, and Dan is out. Brittany was okay with it. Ian said it's not as good as the ideal outcome, but it's better than if Dan or Danielle had won. Frank says, I felt almost as confident as if I had won. Danielle says that she was excited, but then scared. Dan says it was 100% bad. It was the most upset, sad, disappointed, angry he's ever been playing 2 seasons of the show. He saw the writing on the wall. He said, man, this is how it ends. This is how I go out. Frank messes up. I get another chance to go head-to-head against Jen, and I lose to Jen, who hasn't won anything. I'm just mad, and I feel like I blew an opportunity, and I'm going home. At that point, they get into a fight, Dan and Danielle. Now, they didn't really talk about this on the feeds afterward that I can remember. I do remember that there was some, like, a little bit of like talk about it, but like the reason why everyone was so confused when Dan did the funeral is because they didn't know why he was mad. So it surprises me that it was described as a massive fight, because then I feel like it would have been obvious what he was mad about at that point. And Danielle had no indication that Dan was mad at her during his solitary confinement. And then afterward, she felt like he was ignoring her, and she didn't know why. So they say that he was pacing. Why did you guess that? You're not supposed to be playing. Brittany says, because most of this comes from Danielle, Brittany says, yeah, he was mad at her. He was totally mad at her, which made no sense because he was trying to win. That confused me. I didn't understand why they were fighting, fake fighting. They had their own deal on the side that they weren't privy to, that we weren't privy to. None of that made sense. So I think that's probably why they were confused, because they didn't know why he was mad. He was mad because she buzzed in when she had no chance to win, and took points away from him. And I guess they didn't understand where that was coming from, and so they thought maybe it was fake. Who knows? Dan says he walks into the house. He's upset. He's borderline in tears. He goes right to the diary room. He wants to talk to Chris Roach. He feels like he let everyone down. Rich remembers him being very devastated. Allison remembers him saying, my game's over. This is it. He goes into solitary confinement. And I remember the feeds really slowed down at that point. So I was watching this. Ian gets the veto. I was annoyed. I was right there with Dan. Like, I was like, seriously? Like, he loses this veto, then he loses the veto competition. When the feeds came back from the veto competition and Dan did not win it, I was like, oh, that's it. It's over. It was a good run. Good while it lasted. Time to root for Brittany. At least Brittany's doing real well. Okay. I can accept this. I can, Brittany played real good to get here. She's probably going to win this game. I can be okay with that. And I was really just like, yeah, there's no way. There's no way. He's done. And I felt terrible because he's in confinement. And I couldn't even, I remember the feed slowing down, actually. That might actually not be true. I apologize. I'm pretty sure they did, because I have gone back and I watched through everything. But the first time I watched, I remember for a lot of Dan's solitary confinement, I didn't, like, that 24-hour period, I was just like, I couldn't watch the feeds. I was so frustrated. I watched very differently at the time than I do now. I was a very emotional watcher. I went into 24-hour seclusion too, yeah. I was like, all right, time to do life stuff. Time to be a person. My solitary confinement meant going out into the world and hanging out with other people. but I again, I have gone back. I'm pretty sure that most of what happens here, it's mostly Frank going around and securing the vote. He makes sure that Ian's not going to use the veto. Ian promises he's not going to use the veto. He talks to Jen, make sure Jen's not using the veto. She's not using the veto. No way in hell is she using the veto. He makes sure that all of the votes are in place. Everybody is on board. Everybody's voting out Dan. Dan's done. It's over. So he's in solitary confinement. I remember people posting. People love to post clips of Dan with like the techno music blasting, and he looked like a crazy person in there. He had like some cake. He got like some champagne, I think. And there really wasn't much else happening that I can recall. Yeah, right. Yes, he thought there was a veto in there. Yes, right. He was searching. He searched for a veto for a little while. Oh yeah, he says that in the article, doesn't he? First couple of hours I was in there, I remember thinking like something ridiculous, like, oh, there was maybe a hidden veto in the cake. And so Jen's, we're all thinking this is signed, sealed, and delivered. Dan is in there with. They have a picture of him here in the article. He's. It's gross. Like the whole thing is gross. And Dan says he thought about trying to cause a fight between two people, but then quickly dismissed that because it seemed desperate and too obvious a play. People were expecting that, so. He started to piece it together more. He said the best way to wrap up a lie is to wrap it in the truth, surround it in the truth. And he really wanted to start with him taking a shot at Danielle. I remember him, I believe at the start of it, he talked to the cameras. He said something along the lines of like, okay, part one is now's the time to rat Ian out. And I'm going to have to work with Frank. And that's where he started. And then, he talks here that part one was the Danielle thing, but again, he never really talked about that out loud. What he said out loud was the ratting Ian out and working with Frank here. He definitely talked to the cameras a fair amount about strategy. That's one of the things I loved about watching Dan, was that like he very much isn't the kind of like revisionist like history kind of person, because he talked to us about his plans before he did them, and then he would go and do them, and then they would work. And then, of course, in the house, he would also do revisionist history, as he talks about with Danielle. And he did the same thing in Big Brother 10. But it was great. It was great to be able to see him, like, again, when Frank won the HOH and he's like, oh, what do? I gotta work on Joe. I gotta work on Ian. I gotta play, kowtow to Frank's ego. So he says, I have a reason to be mad at Danielle, and so whether or not people realize it, let me take that and build it from there. I can't have a house meeting and then denounce Danielle. I need to gas everyone up first. And so this is where he creates the spectacle. And the idea is to drop this bomb. I mean, I think it becomes clear that like the idea is he needs to rat out Ian to Frank, but how does he, again, he's been holding on to this for a long time, and other people have tried to do this with Frank in the past, and Frank is definitely not prone to believing anything that Dan has to say. So how does Dan present this in the best possible way to give the most likely chance of it working, and also be able to do it in secret, and so that people don't find out and would be able to counter it? And so his first thought was to make a fight between two people. Obviously, what he ultimately decided on was, nah, that's not going to work. How about just a fight between me and somebody else? I'm mad at Danielle. Let's do that. So he starts to formulate the plan, what he's going to say to each person. People are inherently selfish. They want to hear something good about themselves, which is fine. And I get it. I like to hear something good about myself too, but I thought that would disarm people. It gives people the illusion that this is for me. This is it for me. And I want to enjoy the last couple of days because I know my last couple of days, then drop the bomb on Danielle and see what happens from there. He says he knew the most important thing was to cause confusion and chaos so that people were focused on that instead of what I might be saying to Frank upstairs, because that's the whole thing. If I had just taken Frank upstairs and talked to him, then, you know, it would have come down to a lot of questions about, hey, what did you talk to Frank about? People would have been concerned. By causing the chaotic scene, when he came down, it was like, oh, everyone feels bad for Danielle. Dan, what the heck is wrong with you? Not, Dan, what were you doing up there with Frank? And so he says, that's what I thought. 100% honesty. I was like, it's a Hail Mary. Do I think this is going to work? No, I don't. I don't think it's going to work, but it's the only thing I can do to try to stay in the game. Then Julie talks about how the solitary confinement was a blessing in disguise because he was able to come up with this whole plan. It's seeing how impressed the producers were is really really interesting. Again, make sure read along with me here on these, so you can read through some of this as we go. Mike says, were you watching the live feeds at the time of the funeral? Yes, absolutely. We'll get there. So Dan says he had to run it through his head 100 times at least. He said, this is funny. In the article, it says, someone once said that in Big Brother, Dan's a great drop back quarterback, but when he scrambles, he's not very good. In Dan's podcast, he said he thought it was Rob Sesternino, actually, that said that. But he wasn't sure. So that's probably why it's not in the article. He says he's very good when he can plan everything out, but if something doesn't go to plan and it breaks down, he's not very good at improvising. So he really rehearsed everything he was going to say. And he says that people saw him walking and talking under his breath. Yes, I do remember that, definitely. Both in confinement and also outside of the confinement, he was practicing his speech. So he practiced a bit. He knew in his head and ran through it 100 times. He's just not good at improvising in a situation like that. So this was an interesting thing, actually, that Dan feels that he's not good on the spot, that he's better when he's able to rehearse, which, like, thinking about it, I feel is maybe true. He's definitely great when he has time to plan out, and that's definitely his mode of operation. There are, but I also feel like he's not bad on the fly either. There are definitely moments where he loses composure, and I think that's where things break down. And so it's moments like the 2 veto competitions where he lost composure. Later on, when he is talking to the jury in the final 2, he definitely loses composure. And at that point, yes, definitely bad at improvising from there. That said, I feel like it was an interesting way to look at Dan as a player, because I think overall he is one of the best at improvising in the game, because the game is a slow game, and so you have time to adapt most of the time. And so, like, Dan, I think, is the most adaptive player to ever play, personally. But it was interesting to hear that he feels like he needs a little bit of time in order to make that happen, in order to think it through and plan out where he's going to go. Which I think is probably true of most people. I'm trying to think of like when I talked to Derek also talked about how he would plan everything out, and when things happened, he would have plans ready for them. And then Vanessa was definitely somebody that was bad in the moment, but when she could start to think through, she would come back and have a good plan. Dr. Will was very similar. He would definitely think things through. He was very bad in the moment, actually, in some instances. And so he was definitely a planner. I really feel like it's these planners that seem to be a lot of the most effective people here. I'm trying to think of like who's somebody that was good on the fly, like just would get caught, or like when confronted with things completely that they were completely unprepared for. I feel like maybe Andy. But he really planned through things as well. And he got really nervous. Anthony Anthony, yeah, that he's. Although no, Anthony wasn't great on the fly either. Anthony would kind of blow things up and then come back. Yeah, I don't know. Tyler, let me think about Tyler. When was he put in a? Tyler was in a pretty smooth sailing position from a lot of the game, and then when confronted with the hacker twist, he did kind of panic and wasn't amazing. Paul, definitely, I wouldn't say. He kind of lost the game because of a lot of that stuff. Even Danielle, I feel, Donato wasn't. JC, you know what? JC is a great call. JC was fantastic on the fly. That was like his whole game. Good call. Good call. I like that. Just an interesting. I'd never really thought of that, because I feel like on the fly stuff doesn't happen all that much, because there's usually time to plan. But JC was definitely good on that. You know what? Dane was also pretty good. Dane was also pretty good on the fly. The way that he was able to recover from Sam winning the HOH, or sorry, Corey winning the HOH, was definitely, like, he really worked that immediately. Good stuff, guys. All right. So, he gets through solitary confinement. He comes out. He looks ill. He said, and I didn't know this, actually. This is one of the things I was really surprised to hear, or like I was really interested to hear. He said that he moved the like bathroom bucket thing toward the door opening so that it would smell really gross. I didn't know that he did that. I thought it just like genuinely was like super gross in there, because it looked super. And even when I was describing it, like my memory of it was like that they talked about how terrible it smelled, and how disgusting it was. And so in my memory, that whole room is just completely filled with like gross, terrible stench and like mess and vomit and all of that stuff. But definitely seems like in part it was because he moved. It's so good. And there were times that they tried to talk to him through the thing, and he would be like, "Do you smell how gross it is in here?" So I thought that was really funny. So he comes out of solitary confinement. He's like walking like a ghost. He says, Brittany says he was acting so weird. He was acting like a man who was sick. He was giving us the idea that the room had sickened him somehow, like motion sickness kind of thing. Yes, I remember him being like, I need to get outside. I need to get outside. The walls are closing in on me. He didn't say it with that much fervor. He was like, I need to get outside. I feel like the walls are coming. And he didn't want to talk to Danielle, and Danielle was, why does he want to talk to me? Why doesn't he want to talk to me? What did I do? Shane says, I think he played it off like he was kind of insane or worse off than he actually was, so we'd feel bad for him. I think that he had really planned it out as far as his body language, how he came out of the room in order to get us into a room to sit down and talk to us all. My initial reaction was I felt bad for him, but that was all part of his plan. Ian said he looked pale, he looked sick. Ian says he knew he was staging it because he made signs to the camera that like he was okay or something. I'm not sure if he says he caught that because they're definitely not anything that I remember about any conversation about that, but that could be something I missed, or just didn't make the feeds. But he says not even just the way he's acting, he looked physically ill. And yeah, that was the moment, because I remember watching him come out, and I knew that this was part of. I felt like this was some kind of ploy, but like I remember the second he like looked up at the camera and he gave the camera like a wink or something, like I literally was like, oh! What is he doing? What is this? I didn't think it would work though, but I was like, oh, this is exciting because like there's a little bit of doubt, right? Like is he actually, like, I'm pretty sure he's faking this, but maybe he's actually out of it. I'm not. And then when he gave the look to the camera, it was like, oh boy, here we go. Janet, thank you for the $25 donation. Thanks for all your hard work. Much appreciated. Thank you, Janet. Appreciate that a lot. And thank you, Cookie, for that re-up on the subscription. So he comes out. He gives that look to the camera. Joe says when he walks out, you would have thought he was a prisoner of war for 7 years. I mean, he was dead. You would have thought he looked like he'd been there for a month. He said he puked all over himself. I do remember that. But I wouldn't doubt if he had a wet rag and put it all over his face so it looked like he had the sweats. Jen says he looked like he'd been through it. He looked paler than usual, and he storms out of the room, right? And this is real effing truth here. I was like, oh man, this guy's up to something. We all knew Dan was the mastermind and one of the best players of the game, so when he stormed out like that, it was like, oh, it's on. So Jen is definitely somebody that talks about seeing through this. I actually don't doubt her. I think she did. You can see her in the funeral, like being a little bit like, really? And so she had a pretty good relationship with Dan, and she tended to see through some of this theatrical stuff, even though he definitely was able to get her into the place he needed her to be later on in the game. So I don't feel like Jen is being super revisionist here. I feel like it wouldn't surprise me if she actually did see, if she'd actually, at the very least, that she had doubts about it, that she was like, is something going on here? Frank says he came out looking like he had some come to Jesus moment. Brittany says she began to get very worried about him. She remembered him doing the thing with his eyes. I can't focus my eyes because they had strobe lights on in there. He was insinuating the light messed with his eyes. I remember being like, oh my God, Dan is not well. Dan says, I didn't feel well, but I definitely played it up. I moved the toilet closer to the door, made it smell bad. I remember seeing everyone cheering that I survived. They're happy to see me, or at least gave it the illusion that they're happy to see me. I looked over at Brittany and I remember hearing her say, oh, it doesn't smell very good in there. You don't look very good. And I internally smirked and was like, all right, I've got a shot at this thing. Brittany says, this is how stupid I am. I voluntarily go to the diary room to ask production to check on Dan because Dan is not well, you guys. He's not okay. I'm very worried about him. I literally went to the diary room and asked them to check on him. I'm not kidding. I was like, guys, he's not okay. Look what you did to him. Dan says, I wanted people to at least be at least remotely concerned with my health because I didn't want to talk to anyone until my speech because I felt like anything prior to that would diminish it and maybe would tip my hand. So I walked into the spa room and closed the door because at least I could get in a situation where I could limit my exposure. I wanted to keep a low profile, try the speech, and see what happens. I remember him practicing his speech at this point. Danielle says, now he's acting like a mute, like he went through something traumatic. I remember it was like 10 minutes. He came out, he's pacing, goes to the bathroom, does something else. He's like, hey, I want to talk to everyone, go to the living room. And so we're out the living room, and that's when the funeral happened. There was a bit of time before the funeral happened. I remember people being like, hey, Dan's trying something. There was I feel like there was a lot of time. I can't remember now exactly how much time. It was definitely more than 10 minutes. And I remember being in like the chat rooms and on Jokers, and people, oh, look at Dan trying something. It's never gonna work. What is this? What? Come on, Dan. It was two things you were posting on Jokers. Were you one of those people? But I remember, and look, I was mad at those people. But I didn't disagree with them. Two things that it could work. Good for you. I was hopeful. I was definitely hopeful. I was hopeful for anything at that point. But I'm definitely the kind of person, like, I don't let my hopes get up too high. So I also remember that, like, they had been talking about, like, they like when Dan like came out or right before, I don't remember exactly when it was, but they had been talking about like, oh, Dan, he do you think he's gonna? I think it was Frank and Brittany that were talking. Like, he's probably going to be known as the best player to ever play the game after this performance. Like, he's going to leave this week, and he's already probably got that spot, best player to ever play. They were already talking about it before. Again, remember, Dan came into this game with the reputation as at least the second best player to ever play. Perhaps the best. And so that was always part of it. And again, Frank really saw it as like, this is my season, my dream, and this mother effer comes in to steal my spotlight. No, ruining my dream. And so they were talking about like, man, Dan has done so well. He's going to go home. He's going to be known as the best player to ever play now. So then comes the funeral. They go through this bit by bit, which I love. When I walked out of there and saw you guys sitting there, it meant the world to me. So I just wanted you guys to know, and I appreciate that. I'm dressed in all black for a reason. I want to welcome you all to my big brother funeral. Stop crying, Brittany. Brittany says, I really thought this was Dan's way of saying some parting words because he knows he's going home. This wasn't any part of my soul that believed he was planning some big thing. I bought it hook, line, and sinker. I'm over there crying on the couch like, poor Dan, what a guy, what a freaking guy. Plus, he's been poisoned by the Big Brother room in solitary confinement. Now this Big Brother life is just blown up in front of him. I bought into it 100%. Danielle says, I'm so naive. I was like, oh, Dan's saying goodbye to everyone. I was originally thinking he was doing something sweet. And I was like, maybe he went into solitary confinement. He feels bad that he was screwing us all over. Dan says he wanted to disarm everyone and let them think that he was done playing the game. It's the only thing that he could think of that made sense. He could have just had a normal meeting, but he likes to try to make a show. And he needed to cause as much chaos as possible. It must have hit him late, but he wanted to have something to symbolize the death of me as a player to everyone to say, hey, look, he's really done playing the game, just wants to enjoy his time here. And Jen says, I was like, what? This is Antic City. I wish I'd gone to the kitchen and popped some popcorn. Frank says he really didn't want to go down and sit down. He was like, can we get this over with? Ian says that he thought it was some last-ditch attempt to get something going. After this, I remember Brittany being suspicious and everybody else being like, no. What are you talking about? Dan says, I want to say a couple things. Joe, being around you taught me a lot about how to be a good husband. Joe says, you want to believe him. That's the biggest thing. Even when you know Dan and you know what he's capable of and how he works, how he maneuvers, you still want to believe him. You still think there's something, he still thought there was something wrong going on, but because it's this guy, he's too good to go out this way. He's doing something. He says to Shane, he's Captain America, and Shane is crying. Shane says he started to tear up because he said the right things when he had to say them in order for him to advance in the game. I went into the house as real life, and in real life, I'm compassionate. I really care about other people. I care about their feelings, says Shane. He says to Jen that she's the first lesbian he ever met. He says that was a misfire. He wanted to talk about her being in a band, but that was a secret at the time because, oh boy, can't let that out. He said to Brittany that we're always going to have a bond, being newly married. They talked about being married all the time. He said Brittany and I talked about a lot about being newlyweds. He really enjoyed spending time with her, so it was the same thing with Shane and Joe, but it was really more genuine. I feel like we connected and related around that point, so it was just the same thing of bringing up something non-threatening that we both enjoyed talking about. I also wanted to hit her emotional button to maybe make her cry more. It looks like she's crying and misses her husband, and we connect on this, so I'm really just trying to push emotional buttons at this point. Brittany says, he knows me. He knows how emotional I am. He knows my buttons. He knows what buttons to push. This is what is pure Dan Giesling brilliant and why nobody else can compare it to his social game. This is such a teachable moment for the social game in general because he would spend hours, days, and weeks in the backyard talking to each one of us individually, one-on-one, and he was able to to then take that information, tailor it to each of us at the funeral to put us on our most emotional peak. He was able to do that only because of the time investment that he had put in. I've literally never seen anything like it. He put in the time. He worked in that house 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. He never was one of those house guests who is lazy and sleeps until noon and doesn't talk to anyone and goes back to bed at 8. That was not his strategy. He was the house guest that would talk to you in the backyard for hours about what you got for Christmas, what was on your second birthday cake, what was your best present you've ever been given. He would also make the conversation about you and would always make you feel important. He would just make you feel like he cared, and that was what was so brilliant about his game. This moment is in the funeral is where all that paid off for him and came into play, because he knows each person's individual weakness or what strings to pull. Yeah, I mean, that definitely tracks. Like, Dan absolutely talked to everybody all the time and asked them questions all the time. He talked to Brittany about being newlyweds and about gifts and all kinds of stuff like that. He talked to Ian for hours about Pokemon. He knew very little about it, but he talked to Ian about Pokemon all the time. He talked to Joe about about anything that he could relate to with Joe. He talked about being a good husband. He talked to Jen about her band, and he got her to open up about that and really developed a good relationship with her, especially moving forward from this moment. Obviously, the immense amount of control that he had over Danielle. Her thinking that he would use the veto on her for a while, and then when she found out that he wouldn't, she was fine with it. Brittany's great throughout this whole article. I love everything that she has to say. Danielle says she remembers sitting there feeling so sad because she didn't want anyone to feel sad or heartbroken. She cared for Dan so much. She looked at Dan as family. So at this point, she's upset that he's upset, and she's right in the middle of his little trap at this point. Jen says Brittany stuck out to me the most because she felt like she would have a box of tissues with her or something. She's looking at everyone like, you can't be serious. This guy's not dying. It's not like he's going to walk out the door and people in the machetes are just going to cut him up and have him on a grill, serve him. He's going to be alive. He's going to be okay. He's just leaving the house. Joe was talking about how he was like weirded out by it. Julie says, I was like, these people are in tears. It's working. But I was also like, oh my gosh, they've been in this bubble so long they can't see through his phoniness. She talks about how she always saw through Dan. Julie did. Julie, master of seeing through politicians, as she claims. She never liked that he called her Mrs. Chen. She wanted him to call her Mrs. Moonves. Who knew? No, sorry, Julie. She says, watching her work on everyone and seeing all the tears, I'm like, this guy is brilliant. He says, the last three are going to be a bit tougher. Ian, the more and more I was around you, the more you remind me of myself, because you love this place for everything it's worth. You single-handedly made this experience for me. He says, I talk about wrapping a line of truth. In truth, there was a lot of truth to that. We spent a lot of time together. We were kind of kids in the house, really enjoyed playing Big Brother for Big Brother. Some of those tears are real at the end, welling up, and I enjoyed being around him, wanted to make him feel like me. He loved the experience, so I wanted to make him feel the experience even more, if that makes sense. Ian was a fan of the game, says Brittany, having seen Dan's season, knowing that Dan's one of the best, so that's a huge ego boost. Ian says he was a big fan of him on Big Brother 10. He was my favorite that season for sure. Really probably in my top 5 favorite players ever. And now he's saying something very similar to what Mike Boogie said the round before. I was a huge Mike Boogie fan going into the season, so I was very starstruck through the entire process. Honestly, one of the things that makes my game in that season weaker is the starstruckedness with the returning players. I didn't like having to vote out those I feel like I already have a connection with because I've seen them on TV. Dan was very good at using the lore of the show against me to influence my decisions. Frank says, I'm like, save it. Have these conversations one-on-one. I've never been one for pageantry. So, all right, the guy in the carrot suit, Frank, there's a couple things I've said about you I'm not proud of. There's something I wanted to read to you upstairs, and I apologize face-to-face to you in private. Now is not the time or place, but after, I'd like to talk to you by yourself and just get that off the table. Dan says, if I'd said something nice about Frank, it would blow the whole operation because everyone at that point knows me and Frank are oil and water. We're going to head up to the whole game. We're going to head to head the whole game as competitors. There's direct invitation because I know what's about to happen. I'm not going to have the time. I'm not going to have time to tell him. I'm not about to. It's not about compliments with Frank. The game decision depends on him. So get him upstairs, mask it, and apologizing privately. Just get me and him in a room alone so that no one's thinking that we're talking game. And then Frank says, I knew the whole funeral was BS. But he doesn't really mean this. This guy doesn't quit. So it always read false to me. He's just doing this to garner sympathy. And of course, when he said, I've got to talk to you, Frank, I was curious to hear what he had to say. Okay. Sounds like it worked. Joe said, oh, what the hell? Now it's, let's meet Frank in private. Ian says, oh, I saw this as a last-ditch effort. Brittany said, to be honest with you, I'm so dumb and naive and emotional that I didn't really suspect anything nefarious in that. I was just like, all right, Dan has said some things about Frank. They worked on opposite sides of the house. They've been really against each other for the majority of the time. I think he probably just wants to clear the air and not go out on a bad note. I really didn't suspect that he was going up there to try to get off the block. I really didn't. And this is why I love Brittany so much, because she is the person the most that says, I got fooled. I didn't think he was going up there to talk game with Frank. And she, to my memory, is the person that most suspected that he did go up there to talk game. She mentioned multiple times after the funeral, do you think Dan went up there and, talked game? Made some kind of deal? They're not going to use the veto, are they? And everyone else was like, no. We got to focus on Danielle here. She's really hurt. Stop it. I love that she's absolutely willing to admit that in that moment, she was completely fooled, and not feel the need to even point out that later she was the one that wasn't fooled the most. But she was, from what we saw in the feeds, from my memory. Danielle says, I'm starting to melt. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so sweet. I didn't know Dan had this in him, so I'm kind of anticipating what he's going to say to me, Sprinkles, flowers, rainbows, unicorns, you name it. I think it's about to come my way. And I'm not going to lie, I thought that too. I was watching this, and I was getting emotional watching this. And I was anticipating, the big drop on Danielle, he's going to say something so nice. Saying all these nice things. Here's the crux of it. And so he says, and this is great. You should absolutely listen to Dan's recording of the call between him and Dalton, because Dan is just cracking up listening to the quote of himself. He says, so finally, there's Danielle. The last time I played this game, I learned a lot of tough lessons early on, and I learned that you got to find one person and put 100% of your trust in them. As a podcaster, as somebody that likes to provide entertainment, this is just so brilliantly set up. The whole thing leading up to this point was brilliantly set up. And then this bit itself, he's clearly indicated he's misdirecting here. You're thinking that he's about to go, you got to find somebody, put 100% of your trust in them. I thought when I picked you, you'd have similar qualities to Memphis Garrett. It's like, oh, you're just like Memphis. Yeah, I've put all my trust in you. You've been my person. And through my own fault, I was wrong. I was like, I didn't catch it at first that he was, that the bass was dropping here. I didn't even comprehend it at first. It's like, we don't need to get into it now, but in this game, you'll never earn my trust back. I was like, what? Wait, what's happening? What about Memphis? Wait, what? You know what you did, and in this game, you're dead to me. So don't come to me and ask about it, because it's over. It's like, what the fuck? Moving forward, we can be friends outside this. I'll be friends with all of you, but game talk for me ends now. So I hope you guys understand that this was the death of Dan the player. I want the rest of the experience to be fun for everyone and not awkward. I really appreciate it. And of course, Danielle is... She had the best faces. Dan says, what's the crescendo, right? It's like everybody turned over their cup. Oh, there's water in the cup, water in the cup, water in the cup. Oh, Danielle, no water in the cup. I knew she was building up and waiting for the compliment, like, hey, you're my ride or die. I could trust you through thick and thin. But so part of that is trying to devastate her for a couple of reasons. One is that thing is, when I talk about wrapping all these lies in truth, I was really upset with her. I'm not a great actor, so I was able to take that because I was really angry and deliver the blow to her to cause that chaos. Danielle says, literally broke my heart in half. I think about your best friend saying something horrific to you, not wanting to hear your side of it, and knowing that you had done nothing besides protect him the entire game. Before we got nominated, Frank came up to me and was like, would you ever turn against Dan? And I was like, Frank, I cannot lie to you. I will never vote against Dan. I cannot go against Dan. That's true. So I was put on the block partially because of that. Dan was my one person. My word was my bond. So to go through that and then go on the block against Dan and then fight the whole way, the whole game, like I had for him to say that to me and just throw me away like a piece of trash and tell me I'm worthless. I don't even compare to Memphis. I feel like I had done so much more than Memphis up until that point. Granted, she said that she would never betray Dan because at the time she thought Dan would use the veto on her and that she would stay next to Dan no matter what. But still, she did say that. Dan says, I didn't know what was going to happen. I knew she'd be upset. I didn't know the ripple effect it would have on everyone else in the house. I knew it was going to cause confusion. What transpired around that, I knew I had really little control over. But I knew Danielle would be upset by what I had to say. And to me, at least, that would cause some diversion to the chaos. And this is something I talk about all the time on the podcast. Causing chaos, reshaping the house, shaking things up to get a better draw, essentially. People are very... people love to go down the well-trod path, right? Like, if you have the option between like a completely woodsy forest and a path in front of you, you don't veer off into the forest. You follow the path. It's what you do. It's the same thing with mental processes, emotional processes. You do what's familiar. And so what happens in the house often is that things get kind of stuck in their way because you just go with what makes the most sense. And if things continue to be the same around you, you're just going to continue to go down the path and nothing's going to change. So by shaking things up and causing chaos, you're rearranging the path, you're shaking it up, you're putting dirt back over it, and you're making the way forward. You're not going to be just going there through momentum anymore because you've been shaken up. There's no more momentum. You're going to have to start from static. And at that point, you can go anywhere. It's a lot easier to go anywhere. And so that's a large part of what makes this work, right? Is that Danielle is now freaking out. Dan just burned her hard. Dan has now burned the entire house hard. He just did something that socially, it's a social faux pas for sure. Nobody does this. To be a part of watching this, like maybe there's a part of you that's like, ooh, but it makes you uncomfortable. It makes you feel, oh my God, what a terrible person. And And so this person immediately becomes persona non grata, and he is no longer connected to Danielle in the way that he was before, and he is now completely a free agent, and everybody hates him. He's no longer connected. He has no influence over anyone anymore. He just blew up his whole spot. And on top of that, there's now chaos in the house. People are focused on Danielle. They immediately run to Danielle. She's sobbing. Oh, he's such a jerk. He's the worst. He's never going to win this game. He's leaving. He's going home. Screw him. And so he goes upstairs and he talks to Frank. But they talk about here that Shane says, my mouth dropped. I thought he was going to say the exact opposite. I was shocked. I was like, okay, that doesn't make sense. What did she do? Jen says, holy shit. It was great. I freaking loved it. Especially the you're dead to me part. She thought that Danielle was in on it, she says. Brittany says it was a hard turn, a total shock to her, complete and utter shock. Couldn't believe the words coming out of his mouth. For someone who loves to be on the sidelines of drama, for me, this can't get better. This is incredible. This is the best night of my life. I'm just scooping up handfuls of popcorn on this couch, watching this girl melt into a pool of tears. It was so good and bad at the same time. Dan says, even though he wanted to make better TV and say you're dead to me, he didn't want to go that far, and so he said, in this game, you're dead to me. Danielle says, I was just like, are you serious? You have no respect or love for me as a person or anything after everything we've been through to say such horrific things to me? I didn't take it as gameplay. I took it as an attack and kind of bullying. It hurt because I wasn't in the game in that moment. I was like, this is one of my best friends saying this to me. How could he think that I would ever do that to him? I'm so loyal. It felt like a character attack because this is something I would have never done to him. I'm like, what the hell did he think I did? Because I got spots? Is this me? Is all because of guy got spots? Ian says, I went from feeling bad to feeling disgust. Not even so much in what he said. I thought what he said was harsh, not even that harsh. It was sort of a mild statement, but then with her reaction, something struck a nerve and I was just disgusted by it. And that's, I feel that too. Like I have, when I'm watching, I have the same reaction. I go from like confusion to like, what? To like disgust, like, oh my God. Like I have the same thing. I'm like, what an asshole. But then also like in my head, I'm like, what? I was like, what an asshole. This is disgusting. But then my mind was like, what's the angle? Like, what? Hold on. What is the angle here? I knew he was going to go talk to Frank about Ian. That's what I was assuming because of what he had said in solitary confinement. But I couldn't make the connection about what Danielle had done and what the point of this was. It wasn't until he was talking with Frank that I started to think, oh, like now he's a free agent. Now they're all focused down there. And this will help Danielle stay in the game, but he's just burned his relationship with Danielle. And so my mind was racing the whole time. It was an amazing moment. It's incredible to watch, especially live. I was just on the edge of my seat for hours after this because he goes upstairs. Frank says she was crushed when Dan said that, but Danielle would be crushed because she had a big zit on her forehead all damn summer, and it was going to be on camera. I was like, I've been sitting here and battling you guys on the block every other week, and this guy gets on the block, he gives you guys a big speech, and you're all crying? Where are the tears for Frank? I didn't have any sympathy for any of them at that point. Because, that's Frank. So he goes upstairs. And this is when he gives the pitch. He finally decides this is the moment to rat Ian out in the most effective way possible. And the way that he presents it is important, but it takes place over the course of an hour at this point. It's very, it's hard to sort of give a full recap of how he went through this. But they talk about how he brought the Bible up and he swore on the Bible. Again, the Bible had nothing to do with why Dan lost the jury vote. Nothing to do with. Jen didn't care about the Bible swearing. Joe didn't care about the Bible swearing. Ashley didn't care about the Bible swearing. Shane didn't care about the Bible swearing. Shane only cared about the fact that he lost the game. Frank didn't care about the Bible swearing. It was just the fact that it was Dan that lied to him in the first. If Dan had not swore on the Bible, Frank still doesn't vote for Dan. Frank was never voting for Dan from the second he entered the game. From the second he voted Frank out. And then Frank stayed. Frank was not voting for Dan. Again, he had been talking about how he has no respect for his game. He's not a nice guy. He's disgusting. He promised, Boogie that he'd get his head on a pike. There's not a single player in that house that didn't vote for Dan because he swore on the Bible. Not a single player. Brittany would have voted for Dan if he had been sitting next to anybody but Ian. They had a close relationship. That's why she voted for Ian. She told me that. Not a single player in the house cared that he swore on the Bible. It was just something to use to justify the anger that was there, that existed prior to the funeral. Prior to the funeral. Existed from all of them. In fact, it was more fervent before the funeral than it was after the funeral. But that gets forgotten. So he pitches to Frank. He exposes Ian. He says, it wasn't me, it was Ian the whole time. And who is Ian close with? Brittany. Basically exposing Frank at this point feels like he's starting to pull in Jen. He can maybe pull in Joe, but he doesn't trust Joe. And he feels like he's working with Ian and Brittany and Shane, and then he has Ian, and then it's him and Ian and Brittany and Shane. But he's been a little worried about this whole Ian thing. A lot of people have been telling him that Ian is more culpable than he thinks, but he still thinks it's all Dan's fault. And Dan is able, and because again, all Dan did was throw Ian under the bus. That's all he had to do. But you have to remember, Frank thought that Dan was the reason Ian did these things. Dan had to present this in a very specific way in order to get Frank to jump on board. Because Frank was very predisposed to anybody that told him that Ian was actually the person culpable for everything that happened with him and Boogie. He was like, don't be misted by Dan. Don't be fooled by him. Dan's controlling Ian. He's fooling you if he's trying to put all the blame on Ian. No, it's Dan. It's always been Dan. So Frank is the guy that's like, I don't even care if I'm wrong at this point. You are not going to be the one to fool me, dude. No. But Dan was able to break through that, and that's he threw everything, including the kitchen sink, at him to make sure that he did, and he did. So Frank says, I could feel like he wanted to get away because he just dropped the bomb on Danielle. Dan said the last card I had to play was that he got swindled not by me, but by Ian. It was a Hail Mary. He saw Frank's wheel starting to turn. He was like, oh my God, this thing might actually work. Frank says, I kind of went around everybody after that double eviction, acting like they manipulated Ian. And now things are starting to make a little bit of sense. Obviously, I'd seen the relationship between Brittany and Ian getting closer over the last few weeks, and I was a little uncomfortable with it, and all things started to make sense. Dan says, my reaction is number 1, I can't believe this is working. Number 2, I can't believe this is working. And number 3, how is this happening? Here's this guy. He's wearing a carrot suit, taking a bath, chum bath, giving up 2 HOHs. And regardless of all that, he's still considering working with me. Not only that, there's some residual feelings for me taking all that heat from Frank for Ian. It's like that this indirect shot at Ian actually feels pretty good. And of course, if that second veto, if Ian hadn't won it, Ian is going home here. Ian is the target of this this fire, and so it's Brittany that ends up getting sort of the getting shot as a bit of an innocent bystander, a little bit. So Frank says that they need to split up Ian and Brittany. Ian has the veto. They can't take him out. So the target goes to Brittany, which wasn't really Dan's ideal person to take the shot at. I think he would have been fine with Ian going if it were possible. I do believe he tried to get Joe back up on the block, but Brittany was the one that made the most sense with his pitch, and so he's gonna go with whatever he can go with. He mentions that. When swearing on the Bible, everything I was telling him was the truth. I wasn't lying about any of the information. Everything I was telling him was about what already happened. It was 100% true. Frank felt like it was an oversell. Dan, I remember he talked about how he had to do everything he could. He's not going to leave anything on the table and then it doesn't work. He's got to try. He's got to do anything he can to try to stay. If he doesn't stay, he can't win. So there's no use in being like, well, I got to hold this back. And he did talk about how he still wanted to try to keep Danielle in the game, but if it meant sending her home, that's what he would have done. So they make a final 2. I remember Dan saying to Frank something along the lines of like first, you were part of Chilltown. Now, I'm going to be part of the Renegades. which Dan said to a lot of people that season. Which you really like. It's exactly what Chilltown did in season 7. They were like, oh, you've got a Chilltown Cool Kid Club member card. And Dan did the exact same thing. He's like, hey, you're my Memphis. You're my Renegade. And everyone still fell for it. So then Dan goes down, he talks to Danielle, and this is when, this is another one of, I think, Dan's strengths, is that he's able to craft a narrative. And this is why he won unanimously in his first season, because he was able to sell that narrative in the jury questioning. Obviously, not able to sell the narrative when there is no jury questioning or no real jury questioning. But in the house, selling narratives is very effective. He goes to Danielle. She's super upset, and he's able to take the pieces of what happened and sell them as like, okay, how can I make this work? Now that I might be safe, I've given up everything. How much of it can I take back? And so he goes to Danielle and he talks about how I did it to save us. To save us. And she's really mad at him. And he says, there's a moment where I see her smirk and the light goes off, that we're going to be safe. And that's when I knew everything was fine. Obviously, he's able to win her back from this point forward. Frank then convinces Jen to use the veto. She's on board. She says, do I make a deal with the devil? I'm not scared to make a deal with the devil. F Brittany. She's been in this game before. She can go out. And I was all about hurting Ian. Ian, by the way, was like he really hated Joe at the time. He was going off about Joe a bunch. And so him and Joe were not having a great relationship. Part of the reason why Joe was able to, they were able to pull in Joe for the vote. So I remember now, like, once he's able to pull Frank They make the final two. It was like, and it just became a waiting game because there was like something like 12 to 18 hours left before the veto ceremony. I was like, holy crap. Can they keep this on the down low for all of this time? If this gets exposed, it's very fragile. It could easily break apart. There's a lot that Brittany can do, that Ian can do, that anybody can do to reverse this whole thing. Jen talks to Dan about, like, if I use this, are you loyal to us? He says, I'll be in an alliance with you. It's not just a deal, it's an alliance. And at that point, he feels good. That's when he says to the cameras, I believe, this is my finest hour in this game. This works. And so then it's just a game of waiting. Like I was so nervous for hours and hours. And Brittany was onto them. She kept saying things like, what did he go up there for? What did they talk about? They really just, he read him some Bible passages, really? I don't know. And people were ignoring her. Like, they were like, oh, like, because Danielle was still acting very upset, and they were so focused on Danielle, and so it wasn't working. And Brittany actually caught Dan talking to Jen at one point outside, and she was, I just caught Dan talking to Jen. What is she's not? Is she gonna use? What if she uses the veto, guys? Something's going on here. I don't know. And like, no. He was just reading Bible passages. It's fine. She's not going to use the veto. Come on. And people were so confident. They were. I don't remember who. I think it might have been. It might have been Ian, actually. Like. Oh. Dan, supposed to be such a great player. Took him 24 hours to come up with that. That's all he's got? Come on. Then, of course, the veto ceremony happens. And they go through this. It's pretty good. Dan says, it's like when you're playing a game of Clue and you know the murderer and you know who's about to get murdered and you know you're going to win. When he sees Jen stand up at the veto ceremony and do that, he's pinballing with his eyes to see everyone's reaction. Brittany says she was completely shocked. Dan says, I see Brittany realize what's going on. She's shocked. Then I see Ian start to figure it out. Ian says, I'm absolutely pissed. I'm shocked that Dan actually managed to slide out of it. I know that Frank wisened up and he was actually making the right play. Now Frank's actually making the correct move, which is frustrating to me. At this point, Shane says, okay, that's weird. Oh boy, maybe this isn't good for me. Brittany says, I thought Frank was then going to put Shane up because I'd seen him talking to Shane in the backyard. I thought maybe he was just giving him some warning. Made little sense for Danielle and Shane to be on the block next to each other because they were showmans. But no. Dan says, I get the necklace around my neck. I sit down. Frank starts to tell Frank. Frank starts to talk. Frank has not dropped Brittany's name, but you can see Ian breathing heavily, shaking, looking back and forth. He sees the puzzle put together before anyone else. Frank's just jabbing him, basically saying, hey, it's payback time. I can't get you, so I'm going to get Brittany. You see Brittany's mouth drop, and Ian's like, no. Ian says he's not somebody who takes losing kindly. He's not a good loser at any game for a lot of reasons. He doesn't lose games much. And two, just bad history with any time I would lose. Even in Boy Scouts, I would lose the stupid game where you have to blow the wooden boat through the water with a straw. I remember I came in third and I threw a massive tantrum in front of everyone. He doesn't take losing well. And he did not. Got into a big fight with Frank afterward. Brittany says, as the speech started to roll out, that's when I started to realize, oh my God, this is happening. Frank and I had just screamed at each other earlier in the week about him yelling at Ian, so we're not on great terms by any means, but I was just not expecting it. She was on pretty good terms with Frank. She was really working him. Maybe she doesn't remember how good she was doing. Jen says it was almost like the air got sucked out of the room. Dan said, for me, it's at that time is not time to celebrate. It's time to look somber. When somebody's going down, you don't rub it in their face. That was my moment to just internally go nuts, but don't show a sliver of it externally. Um, Frank says, I could see in Brittany's face that she saw the win. She saw Dan going home and her winning in the end. She could have taken Ian to the end. She was going to get the votes. It didn't matter who she took. And I think she was almost tasting it. I saw that look, and I'm not reveling in it by any means, but it did make me feel I made the right decision. Ian says, even though I was mad at Frank, I knew he made the right play. I was actually more impressed that Frank had the balls to do it than it was that Dan was able to get himself pulled down. Frank says, Ian was so mad at me for sending Brittany home because he thought the same thing, that when Brittany went home and that he couldn't win because that was his closest ally, he was upset. He felt he got exposed, and he was. Brittany says, as much as I knew that Dan was dangerous, I did not know that he could pull it off. I didn't think anything would ever distract Frank from his number one target, which was Dan. I didn't even see it being a possibility. She did. Give yourself some more credit, Brittany. But she's being honest in the sense that, like, she thought of it as a possibility, but also dismissed it, which is the real way of being honest. These are things I wasn't even worried about. I essentially thought I was safe. Danielle says, my biggest regret was not being able to tell Brittany. Okay, that's fine. She was definitely pretty happy about it, though. But she was upset. She was upset that it had to be Brittany. Brittany says, I also knew that Dan was driving Danielle's game. He was the puppet master. She was the puppet. He was driving every single thing that she did. Brittany says, Danielle says, I could start crying now. It still hurts me. That is the one lie throughout the game, even to this day. If I take myself back to that moment, that hurts me. It was absolutely traumatic, but I was playing game 2 and I still needed to win that money. Dan felt good game-wise about Brittany going home, but he didn't feel good personally because he liked her. Brittany says she was super mad, and it was brutal, but at the end of the day, she knew that he was just a genius. Even as mad as she was, I was like, he's just that good. He got me. He can get whatever he wants. And of course, there's the aftermath. And there's a lot of talk about, like, they get to the end now. Ian feeling like he could win. Dan felt like he would win. He knew when Jen cast her vote that it was done. Brittany knew that Dan wasn't going to win no matter what, even though she had been sort of campaigning for him to do well, especially if he was up against Danielle. Shane said, at that point, I was still very bitter. All the emotions were still very new. I was still struggling with at that point in time. Ian did play a good game. He had a lot of HOHs, had some POVs, played both sides. He and I didn't have any arguments the whole time. That's not true. So his gameplay was spot on. Dan's was good, but Ian did it in a better way, not a cutthroat way, said Shane. I remember Shane being very upset because he felt like Dan had stolen money from him. He really felt like he was destined to win the game. Brittany said, I was around in this jury, and I knew for a fact Dan was not going to win. Jen said, people are mega pissed at him. That was a bitter jury. The biggest mistake Dan made in his game was the jury management portion, says Jen. Shane said, when you start swearing on the Bible, I understand it's a reality show. You do what you do to get by, but that didn't sit well with me. Do I agree with everything you did? No, I don't. But I wish that I went into that season knowing that it was not real life and that you can do anything to win. Again, Shane had no problem with it until after Dan betrayed him. Jen said, I didn't care. I know people took it seriously, but I didn't care. Give the guy a break. Danielle said, my vote for Dan was more, I see how much of a shitty person you are, and I'm not going to stoop to your level. Okay, Danielle. Joe said, one of the biggest reasons I heard amongst the jury to not give Dan in the room was not... Here's Joe. One of the biggest reasons that I heard amongst the jury to not give it to Dan in the room wasn't bitterness. It was that he had already won the game. That sucks. I would rather you lose to bitterness than to, hey, we don't want him to win twice. They were just hell-bent on him not getting it twice. That's the words that were used in the deliberation room. We can't give it to Dan twice. Look how cute Ian is. Ultimately, in the end, I believe the reason Dan did not win is because nobody wanted him to win twice. And that was something that Boogie talked to Frank about as well. There was definitely some incentive there. Brittany talks about Frank and how Frank talked about how he used the Bible in his ring and all of this stuff. Again, these are all the same arguments that Frank had made prior to the funeral, but then after the funeral was like, oh, here's a little bit of better ammunition than before. Frank says, I didn't ever look at my vote as bitter. It's embarrassing getting sent home and knowing that it was all because of a 21-year-old kid. He says that Ian is the reason that he got blindsided. We saw Frank on the Bibbler 18 feeds. Allison said they were a bitter jury. Frank was duped a couple times by Dan and had wanted him out and then got by him. And I remember at that jury roundtable, he was not happy. So there was a bitter component. Rich says, I remember myself watching Dan like, wow, this is the best game I've ever seen. It was incredible. Julia says, at the time, I thought the jury didn't make the right call. And then rewatching the finale, she felt like he did well. Which again, like, yeah, that finale, unfortunate. Danielle said, after the show, I was done with him. My family was so upset. My dad didn't even come to finale night because of Dan. My dad respected Dan and thought Dan was going to protect me. My dad's name is also Dan. So my dad was afraid to come because he would have confronted him, gotten into a verbal altercation. I remember that Dan saw my brother and ducked inside a room, the coward. Dan says, I understood, I got it. We were supposed to ride until the end. If that would have happened to me, I can't sit there and tell you that I wouldn't have been salty for a while. I get it because we were close in the house. We had a really close friendship. I trusted her implicitly. Shane says, you know what? I still haven't watched the season in full, to be honest. I really struggled with it. It was how everything happened at the end with me. It was very hard to deal with. Danielle says, I didn't speak to Dan for a really long time after the show. I didn't speak for several reasons, including my respect for Shane. Shane was going through a lot of trouble at the time. Shane says, there were a lot of things that weren't disclosed to me about Dan and Danielle's relationship in that show, and sometimes it hurts knowing that a lot of things weren't said to me that Dan and Danielle had conversations about, and obviously she had more trust in him than me, it seemed. I've definitely heard that Shane still carries a torch here for some of the bitterness here. That he had a lot of trouble handling this post-show stuff, and this definitely is in line with what I've heard. The medic, thank you for the cheer there. Danielle says Shane and I dated for a while after the house, but he had a lot of stuff to work through. Shane never understood me voting for Dan over Ian. Shane says, I really struggle with the fact that Danielle was the only one to vote for him. That put a lot of bitterness in my heart. You're going to vote for somebody that voted me out? Doesn't make sense. Danielle says, Dan says Danielle was the only person he trusted 100%. It was vice versa. But he was always a little skittish because she had that with Shane as well. Danielle says, Dan and I have not seen each other since we were on the finale 7 years ago. I honestly don't know what I would do if I saw him. I don't know if I would cry, scream, or yell. I don't know. Frank says he's happy with his vote. Of course. Joe says, no respect to Ian because I absolutely love him, but if I had to do it over again, it would be Dan by far. Being in the house and the way it happened, you didn't see the magnitude of Dan's moves. Once you get out of that house and we start watching it for ourselves, it was crazy just how good Dan was. Shane said, I'd stick to Ian 100%. I absolutely would. Dan broke his word with me. It was just lie after lie. I did have some bitterness. It's gone now. I've forgiven Dan. I've forgiven Danielle. But yes, it's very hard to vote for somebody that was the reason you left the game that you could have potentially won. Brittany says they were both deserving to win, and she would have either voted for either one of them happily. But she felt her vote for Ian was fair, and that she does still feel comfortable for voting for either of them. Danielle says she still would do the same thing. She would still vote for Dan. She's a loyal person. Jen says, yeah, sometimes I think I would have thrown my vote to Dan. But whatever. They talk about, is Dan's funeral the greatest moment ever on 24 seasons of Big Brother to air in the United States? Rich says, there are a lot of incredible moments. This is definitely the top of the list. Allison says, in terms of encapsulating everything that is really fun to watch about Big Brother, it has the spectacle, the emotion, the drama, the immense strategy, psychological component, the human chess game that we talk about so much when we talk about how this game is played. It had it all. Danielle says, beyond the Dan stuff, Brittany and I have not spoken since the game. I think she was so hurt and betrayed by the fact that I knew she was going to be on the block. She's never said an ill word about me, nor would I, but the fact that we've never spoken breaks my heart. Brittany says, it was amazing, it was flawless, it was a culmination of all Dan's hard work and the power of his mist. We've coined the phrase very early on in the game, the mist that you put you under when he talked to you, you're under his mist. The funeral was the mist at its most powerful point. For me, if I'm going to have to go out and lose my second time playing Big Brother, I'm glad I went out in something so iconic and memorable versus just being any other old boot. It's so sad how dumb I was, though. I'm sadly not any smarter still. Good old Brittany. Julie says, probably the single greatest moment in Big Brother history. Frank says, from my perspective, anytime anyone's brought the funeral up, I've kind of scoffed at it because I've never felt like the funeral did anything to change his game. It was him ratting his squad out up in the HOH room and unnecessarily making promises on his cross and Bible. None of that promising on any of that made any difference. It was just him filling me in on what I didn't know before. Oh boy, Frank. Ian says, I know Dan likes to make a big spectacle of everything. One of the things he talked about was he wanted to be considered the best. Fair enough. Okay. Jen says it was one of the coolest, awesomest moments in Big Brother history. Joe says, when it comes to Big Brother history and iconic moments, nothing comes close. Dan says, it's not for me to say. Not for me to say. There you go. So when the veto happens, when everything goes down, it was amazing. It was amazing, an amazing moment to see live on the feeds, to see on the episode. It was incredible to watch the rest of Dan's game that whole time. Like, legitimately, for me, it probably changed the trajectory of my life. Like, I had been a huge fan of Big Brother for a long time. Season 9, not a fan of. Season 10 really reignited my interest. But then season 11 was like, season 12 I liked, but season 13 really bogged me down. And then I got to season 14, and the funeral was the thing that just completely locked me back into the show. Like, it was a lot of commitment for you know, I at the time, like, I had just gotten to college and you know, somewhat recently, and I had been you know, traveling abroad and like doing a lot of other things, and I was starting to kind of, in a way, grow out of the show. Not to say that it can be grown out of, but I think a lot of people tend to have like ebbs and flows. But this moment to me was the pinnacle of almost anything I've ever seen on TV. Just what can happen, and that it's real and that it's live. Like, this is what Big Brother is about. So, you know, this I used to just talk to people about this moment all the time. Like, no, seriously, like, you can make fun of me for liking the show all you want, but this is art. This is beautiful. This right here is a moment that transcends the genre. And when people watch it without the context, they tend to agree, because it's that good, and it's that fun. It's everything that you want. It's interesting to analyze. It's dramatic. It's fun. It's horrifying. It's interesting. There are so many different ways to come and look at this, and it's really, really interesting. I feel like there's often, people misremember a lot of what happened around it, and so I really wanted to kind of go at it from my perspective. And I want to say again, this is my perspective. It's my memory of what happened. I do my best to remain unbiased. Obviously, this is a very pro Dan remembrance of this whole circumstance, because I genuinely felt, because I lived it pro Dan, and then after the fact I did go back and I tried to look at it as objectively as I could. I tried to poke as many holes in it as I could, because at the time I was really doing a deep dive. I still felt like Will was the better player at the time, and so I was trying to poke holes in Dan's game anywhere that I could. And then I did the same thing to Will, and that's when I ultimately came down on the side of Dan, as everyone now knows. But at the time, I was pro Will, and I try my best to be as fair as possible, and I know that that's impossible for any one person to truly do, but I do try my best. And so any pro Dan sentiment here is truly and honestly my best attempt at trying to set the record as straight as possible when it comes to some of the misconceptions out there. And I love this. It's quotes from the actual people talking about it themselves. I highly encourage anyone to go back. I don't know, I'm sure there are clips. I'm sure there's recaps that you can find out there still, but this is what I watched the show for. This is it. This is what it's all about here. So thanks for hanging out with me for the stream. I am gonna put this up on YouTube for people to watch after the fact. I hope that it's somewhat interesting. 2.5 hours of me just rambling. As it's basically like a big long live feed update in some ways. But huge props to Dalton Ross for putting this whole thing together. It was really, really fun to read, and yeah, thanks again for hanging out with me here. It's time to watch a Big Brother 21 episode, so that's still where we are after all this time now, 7 years since. I don't think I would have been invested enough in Big Brother at the time that the podcast opportunity came up, if not for this moment, for Dan playing in season 14. So kudos to Dan, kudos to the season, and here we go. Let's do it. Thanks again for hanging out with me, and I'll see you guys later.